thank you for being with us tonight. And we're launching off into First Kings. We're going to go as quick as we can while not brushing over anything. And we're also going to be as thorough as we can while not getting bogged down. I hope you've read both books, First and Second Kings, and with First and Second Samuel and First and Second Chronicles, First and Second Kings forms a series of 3 double books. As I shared last week, I believe it was, these books were originally part of one scroll. But if you can imagine, all of this material got to be too difficult to carry around. Some poor guy had First and Second Kings in one scroll, and it was heavy. And so they divided it up into 2 books. First Kings records the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon into 2 kingdoms as they divide. And this is important. If you remember this throughout both of these books, and in fact on into First and Second Chronicles, it will serve you well. We need to remember that after the reign of Solomon, the nation Israel split. There was a civil war, and the northern kingdom retained the name Israel. It was made up of 10 of the 12 tribes: Asher, Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, and Zebulun. And the kingdom of Israel, after the split, is known as the northern kingdom. So, Israel, 10 tribes, northern kingdom. Lock that in. And then also remember Judah, 2 tribes, southern kingdom. If you keep Israel and Judah straight, and remember that one consists of the territory of 10 tribes, that's the northern kingdom of Israel, and the other one consists of the territory of only 2 tribes, that's the southern kingdom of Judah, that will serve you very well. So in the northern kingdom, also known as Israel, Samaria became the capital. We'll get to that eventually. And in the southern kingdom, Jerusalem became the capital. Jerusalem had already been the capital city during the days of David and Solomon, and that was retained even after the Civil War and the split into 2 nations. So First Kings records the division, Second Kings records the collapse. And so we launch right in chapters 1 through 11, we find King Solomon. Another thing to know about Solomon, because in order for the books of First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles to make sense, because there is significant overlap, we need to keep the progression straight. And so the progression of the kings of Israel so far, Saul was the first, King Saul. He was anointed by Samuel and then rejected by God because of his pride and his lack of respect for the things of God. He was succeeded by David, known as a man after God's own heart. David's fatal flaw was his adultery with Bathsheba, and that caused God to remove the blessing from his kingdom. His son Solomon succeeded him, and that's where we are now. Solomon is the last king to rule a united nation. He's the last king to rule all of Israel. David's getting old, and because he was getting old, he was having a difficult time staying warm. His health was failing. And so they were very concerned about David. Now, he's still the king, but they're very concerned about him, and they know his time is short. And as was a common practice of that day, in fact, it goes all the way from the ancient Old Testament era all the way up through the Middle Ages, when a ruler became so old and feeble that he could no longer stay warm, they would bring in a young lady to lie next to him and keep him warm. Now, we have to understand, in order to keep the context, this is an absolutely non-sexual practice. And this woman named Abishag was brought in to serve as David's nurse and also to lie down beside him and help keep him warm. Now, even though David had already named Solomon his successor, Adonijah, who was another one of David's sons, born through his mother Haggith, put himself forward to be king. Adonijah was David's fourth son, and David had already said, Solomon is going to succeed me. But Adonijah gathered chariots and horses and got a few guys around him, and then David found out what he was up to, and for whatever reason, did not rebuke him. Excuse me. It begins to get complicated because Adonijah gained the support of Joab, who you may recall was David's commander-in-chief, and he also gained the support of Abiathar, who was David's priest and spiritual advisor. And so these two very important government officials were not supporting David's choice for the succession. They were supporting Adonijah. And this, of course, was going to lead to civil war. And Adonijah sacrificed sheep and cattle and other things, and he invited all of his brothers and the king's sons and all the officials of Judah, but he did not invite three key people: Nathan, who was a prophet; Benaiah, who was a man of God; and his brother Solomon. They were all excluded along with David's special guard. Adonijah was careful to leave out the ones who would be loyal to David, the ones who he knew he stood zero chance of pulling over to his side. So then the prophet Nathan goes to Bathsheba and advises her to go to David and say, hey, this is what's going on. You've got to do something. So David instructed Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah to anoint Solomon. He said, let's just get on with it. And they anointed Solomon, and almost instantly the support for Adonijah faded. And King Solomon chose to spare Adonijah's life, even though he had been in open revolt. From his deathbed, David gave Solomon a charge, and then he also told him to settle some old scores, which Solomon actually did. Now, shortly after David died, Adonijah sent Abiathar, sorry about these names, we'll get them. He sent Abiathar the priest to ask for permission to take Abishag. You remember Abishag? She's the young lady that was brought into the household as David's nurse and to help keep him warm. And all of a sudden, Adonijah wants her to be his wife. Now, Solomon found this to be extremely offensive, and he had Adonijah executed. And he banished the priest Abiathar. And then he had Joab executed. 3 years later, he had Shimei executed as well, all according to his father's instructions and also according to the will of God. Now, when God came to Solomon and told him he could ask for anything he wanted, he asked for wisdom. All of a sudden, I've got multiple answers. Thank you, ladies. And God was so pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom that he told him, I'm going to give you everything else as well. I'm going to make you wealthy. I'm going to give you honor in the eyes of other nations. I'm going to give you peace in your kingdom, because God was so very pleased that Solomon asked for wisdom in order that he could be a good king. Then, as an example of Solomon's wisdom, we come across this dispute. Now, I'm convinced that the writer of First Kings included this dispute in chapter 3 specifically as an example of Solomon's wisdom. These two women came before the king, and one of them said, hey, we both had babies about 3 days apart, and they were both lying with us in our beds, and she rolled over on hers and killed it, and then she pulled a switcheroo. She gave me the dead one, and she took the live one for herself. And of course, the other woman disagreed. Well, then Solomon stands up from his throne, pulls his sword, and says, all right, we'll divide the baby, and both of you can have a half. At which point, of course, one of the women said, no, don't hurt the child, just give it to the other woman. But the other woman said, no, divide it. We both deserve half. At which point Solomon knew who the true mother was, because no mother would want her child to be cut in half. And so he gave the living infant to his mother, the one who had said, go ahead and rather than have you cut him in two, give it to the other woman. And that was an example of Solomon's wisdom. And using this wisdom, he established his government. He delegated certain duties and set up a system. He took care of his people. He issued wise rulings. And he also began the process of securing materials and designing and building the temple as well as a palace in Jerusalem. When the temple was finished and it was time to dedicate it, the Ark of the Covenant was brought in from Shiloh. Remember, the Ark was being kept in the old tabernacle that was permanently set up in Shiloh. Well, now the temple is finished and the tabernacle is no longer necessary. And so Solomon had the Ark of the Covenant brought into Jerusalem and placed in the holy place at the center of the temple. And when he did, Scripture says in chapter 8, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Now, in all fairness, we have to acknowledge Solomon was king over Israel during its peak. Israel was never more prosperous, never more peaceful. The people were never more happy than they were under King Solomon. However, I want to draw your attention back to Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. These are the instructions of Moses, even before Israel had a king. You know, Israel didn't have a king in the days of Moses, but God had shown him what was going to happen. And so Moses wrote it down and instructed the people, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. That's the first thing. Let God choose your king. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. That's the second thing. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. So they weren't supposed to amass huge numbers of horses, and they weren't supposed to go back and have dealings with Egypt. He must not take many wives, Moses cautioned, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of the kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God. And so what was supposed to happen? the books of the Pentateuch, commonly known to the Israelites as the books of the law, were to be hand copied by every new king, so that the new king would become very well acquainted with these books of the law. And in so doing, he would make himself a better king, because he would be not only acquainted with the law, he would be acquainted with God himself. He would know the consequences of departing from the ways of the Lord. Solomon, to be blunt, is the dumbest smart guy you'll ever meet. He gets a reputation. You think of Solomon, you think of wisdom. You think of Solomon, you think, well, he's the wisest king ever. And he was. But for a smart guy, he sure did some stupid things. When Solomon was very young, just beginning his reign, he made an alliance with, guess who? The Pharaoh of Egypt. And he married Pharaoh's daughter as a way of securing the alliance between their two nations. He's already violating the instructions of Moses. He accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. And the weight of the gold that Solomon received every year was somewhere in the neighborhood of 666 talents. That could be measured in tonnage in modern weights and measures. And so he's collecting all of this from the other nations, and he's collecting taxes from the merchants and the traders and tributes from the other kings, because he was the most powerful guy around. And he made 200 shields of hammered gold. They were the big shields, and 300 shields that were the small ones. He also made a great throne, and he covered it with gold. Solomon began to get a little carried away, and he violated the instructions of Moses that kings not acquire huge amounts of gold. It got to the point where King Solomon's goblets were all gold, and all the household articles were gold, and nothing was made of silver, it says, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's day because there was so much of it. So he's violating the wisdom of Moses. And then, in addition, where Moses had cautioned not taking a number of foreign wives, King Solomon loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." In fact, Solomon had 700 wives from other nations and 300 concubines. And as he grew old, the scripture says, they turned his heart after other gods. Now, don't blame the women for that. This is all on Solomon. And he began to go and build shrines and altars to the gods of his wives. Now, it's not clear whether or not he worshiped them, but he was violating the law when he did that. He was violating the commandments that he himself had hand copied into the scroll that was read before him every day. And finally, God had enough. And he came to Solomon and he said, "Since you have not kept my covenant or my decrees, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. However, for the sake of your father David, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son." As a result of his sin, Solomon, for the rest of his life, had to deal with rebellion and skirmishes and little wars and battles here and there, as these other little wannabe kings would rebel, and he had to deal with them. He reigned over Israel for 40 years. And then scripture says he rested with his ancestors, and Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. Now, yes and no. Here's where the division comes in. Yes, Rehoboam upon the death of his father Solomon, ascended to the throne. That's in chapter 11, verse 43. Then there was a contingent led by Jeroboam. Now, who's this Jeroboam guy? Well, he was one of the guys that rebelled against Solomon, and Solomon had banished him. He sent him from the kingdom. Jeroboam ended up in Egypt, hiding from Solomon because he knew if he returned to Israel during Solomon's lifetime, the king would have him executed. Well, now the king's gone. And so Jeroboam returns. And so once he has returned, the people gather around him and they send him with some representatives to Rehoboam with a request. They ask him to lighten the tax burden on them during Solomon's days, and it was okay because the nation was prospering. And Solomon exacted heavy taxes. He was building the temple, and he was building the palace, and he was improving the city of Jerusalem and securing the walls and doing all of those important things, and all of that took money. And so he took taxes from everyone in the nation. And now that these projects are finished and Solomon is gone, the people come and they ask his son Rehoboam to let up a little bit. Well, Rehoboam went first to his elders, and his elders, his advisors, gave him sound advice. It's in chapter 12. They said, listen, go ahead and adhere to their request. Go ahead and give this to them. Lighten their tax burden. If you serve the people, if you treat them well, they will always be loyal to you. This is a great opportunity for you to build your kingdom in the hearts and minds of the people. However, Solomon also sought the advice of a group of people that the scripture refers to as the young men who had grown up with him. Their advice was a little different because they didn't have the experience of his elders. They didn't have any real skin in this game. They had not ruled under his father Solomon. They'd not been responsible for any of those things. And they basically said, hey, tell him to suck it up. Tell him to get over it. Tell him, listen, you think my father was bad? I'm going to be worse. You think he put you under a heavy yoke? I'm going to be heavier. He scourged you with whips. I'm going to scourge you with scorpions. Now shut up, go home, and pay your taxes. Well, when the Israelites heard this, after Jeroboam returned back with the bad news, they turned around and made Jeroboam king. They said, fine, Rehoboam, if that's the way you feel, we don't want you as our king anymore. We're going to follow Jeroboam, and thus begins the civil war. Only the tribe of Judah and the decimated tribe of Benjamin. Remember, the Benjamites had gotten hammered a few decades before, and they'd not yet recovered from it. So their military might was not all that much. So they stayed with Judah. So you have the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin that are loyal to the house of David, and Rehoboam is David's grandson. And then you have these other 10 tribes who are now in revolt, and they're following Jeroboam. And Rehoboam gathers his troops, and he's going to go to war and protect his throne, which is rightfully his according to the rules of succession. But God came to him through a prophet and said, don't do this. Don't go against your brothers, the Israelites. Just go home, for this is my doing. And so Rehoboam went home. He was still king over Judah and Benjamin. Now we have the southern kingdom. Rehoboam's capital is in Jerusalem. Jeroboam's capital is up north in Samaria. And Jeroboam did not want his people going to the temple in Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. He was afraid that while they were there, they would just slip over to the other side. And so you have almost in effect the old Berlin Wall kind of thing. You got this wall between these two nations, and Jeroboam wants to make sure that none of his people sneak out and go over to the other side. And so his solution, being the first king of the new northern kingdom of Israel, was to build 2 golden calves. That was his solution. He placed one in Bethel and the other in Dan, and he told his people, listen, you don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore to make your sacrifices. You don't have to do that. In fact, Jeroboam established his own priesthood. He established his own festival. He, in essence, established his own religion, not only in open rebellion against Rehoboam, the rightful king, but also in open rebellion against God. So the nation of Israel is now officially split between these 2 young men. Rehoboam is the king over Judah, and Jeroboam is the king over Israel. And that's the way it's going to continue all the way through. Now, we jump ahead after Jeroboam's built his 2 golden calves. A prophet came from Judah, because on the Judah side of the division, they weren't hindering people from going back and forth. Okay, they were letting them travel if they wanted to. So a prophet traveled from Judah to Bethel, and he confronted the king there, who was making sacrifices. Jeroboam was there making sacrifices, and this is what the prophet said. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David, and on you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here. He's actually speaking directly to that altar where that golden idol was mounted. And human bones will be burned on you, he said. This is the sign the Lord has declared. This altar will be split apart, and its ashes will be poured out. Now, Jeroboam heard about this, and he was angry, and he stretched out his hand and started to point at the prophet and shouted, "Seize him." But when he did, his hand shriveled up with leprosy, and he couldn't pull it back. Also, in that moment, that altar cracked in 2, split apart, and all the ashes that had accumulated on it poured out on the ground exactly the way the prophet said they would. Now, because of his sin, God said to Jeroboam, listen, I gave you a chance. I appointed you ruler over Israel, this northern kingdom. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And you've done more evil than all those who lived before you. You've made idols. You've turned your back on me, and I'm going to bring disaster on you and your house. I'm cutting everyone off, and I will raise up for myself a king over Israel. And this new king will give Israel up because of the sins Jeroboam has committed and caused Israel to commit. Meanwhile, over in the southern kingdom, Rehoboam was no better than Jeroboam. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord, the scripture says. They set up for themselves high places. Now, a high place in that era, it was a common practice to, when you had a village, you'd look around and you pick the highest little hill and you'd put a shrine there. Now, in the nation of Israel, those were supposed to be altars to God, and they were never to replace the temple or the tabernacle. They were altars for local worship, but they were not to replace the sacrifices that took place at the temple in Jerusalem. They were allowed, though. They were places of prayer and worship. But over time, it became commonplace for people to put these altars on high places, and they were all kinds of pagan gods and idol worship. And so that's what happened in the southern kingdom. People set up these high places with sacred stones and Asherah poles, and they even had shrine prostitutes in some places. And the people engaged in all kinds of detestable practices, much the same as the people the Lord had driven out when he gave them the promised land. And along comes Shishak, king of Egypt. He attacked Jerusalem, and when he did, he carried off all the temple treasures and all the treasures from the palace. And there was continuous warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Then Abijah, let's say it that way, Abijah, succeeded his father Rehoboam. That's in chapter 15. He reigned just 3 years. And scripture says he committed all the sins of his father, and the war with Jeroboam continued. He didn't get anywhere with that any more than his father did. And then Asa succeeded Abijah in Judah. He succeeded his father, and he reigned 41 years. Now, here's the difference. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He expelled the prostitutes. He got rid of the idols. His heart was fully committed to the Lord, and he brought into the temple all the silver and gold and the articles that he and his father had gathered. And so he was king over Judah for 41 years. Back over in the northern kingdom, Nadab succeeded his father Jeroboam. Nadab only reigned for 2 years, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That's going to be a common thread. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. But in Nadab's case, a man named Baasha from the tribe of Issachar assassinated him. So Baasha usurped the throne by assassinating King Nadab, and he became king. That's chapter 15, verse 33. He reigned for 24 years, but he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of Jeroboam. You remember Jeroboam, he built these false places of worship, and he encouraged the Israelites to take part in idol worship. As soon as Baasha began to reign, he killed Jeroboam's entire family. Now, this was a weird, gruesome way, but it fulfilled the prophecy that had been given when, through the prophet, God told Jeroboam, "You're out." And so Baasha is the king over Israel. Elah succeeded his father Baasha. That's in chapter 16, and he only reigned for 2 years. And then Zimri, one of his officials, came in and assassinated him. And Zimri became the king. He usurped the throne by killing Elah, and he reigned for 7 days. When the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they named Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel. Then they laid siege to Tirzah, where Zimri was, and when he saw the city was taken, he went into his palace and set the place on fire around him, killing himself. Then Omri succeeds as king over Israel through a military coup that we just described. He reigned for 12 years. And the people were split into 2 factions in Israel. We almost split into 3 kingdoms. Half of the people supported a man named Tibni, and the other half supported Omri. But Omri's army was stronger, and he put down the rebellion and continued as king. Now, Omri is important because he's the guy that secured the hill of Samaria. He bought it, and he built a city there, and called the city Samaria. And that's where the capital of Israel eventually was set up. But Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the writer says he sinned more than all those before him. Ahab succeeded his father Omri in chapter 16. He reigned from Samaria. He was the first king to sit on the throne in Samaria, and he did so for 22 years. Ahab, it says, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, to worship idols. He also married a woman named Jezebel, and she brought with her the worship of Baal. She brought with her priests to Baal. She brought with her prophets of Baal. She brought all these things, and she insisted that this nation that she was now queen over, since Ahab is king, was going to worship Baal. In fact, Ahab built a temple to Baal right there in the capital of Samaria. And he made Asherah poles, and it says he did more to arouse the anger of the Lord than all the kings of Israel before him. Enter Elijah. Israel, the northern kingdom, has reached a point where they desperately need a man of God to come in and do something. And so Elijah comes on the scene in chapter 17 of 1 Kings. He told Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." And then he booked. To protect him from Ahab, God told Elijah to hide in the Kerith ravine. And while he was there, God supplied him with water, and he had the ravens bring him meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. Bread, meat in the morning, bread and meat in the evening. So God took care of him while protecting him from Ahab, who obviously is not thinking too highly of Elijah at this point. Then God sent him to the home of a widow, and this is described in chapter 17. And when he gets to where he's going to meet this widow that is going to provide him a place to stay and food to eat, he asked her for some water and a piece of bread, and she said, "I don't have any bread. I only have a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug, and I'm gathering these few sticks so I can go home, make a meal for myself and my son so we can eat it and die." Her outlook was not very good. But Elijah told her, because remember, he's the prophet and God is speaking directly through him. He told her, "Go home and do as I ask and see what happens. God will take care of you." And so she did. For whatever reason, she had faith in Elijah as a man of God. She made him a little loaf of bread and brought it back with a little water to drink. And from that day until the very end of the drought, that jug of oil and that flour pot did not run dry. And the widow and her son had plenty, and God took care of her. Elijah was not the only prophet in Israel. Okay, there were several prophets, but Jezebel, it says, was killing them off. And there was a man named Obadiah who took 100 prophets and hid them in 2 different caves. And he took care of them. He brought them food and water. And so he's listed there as someone who took care of these prophets and protected them from Jezebel. Then God sent Elijah to Ahab. And when Ahab saw Elijah, he said, "Is that you, troubler of Israel?" He did not like Elijah. And Elijah came back and said, "I've not made trouble for Israel. You have. You and your father's family have. You've abandoned the Lord's command and followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel." And you can almost hear the Western music. There's going to be a showdown. And that's what it is. Elijah called Ahab and all these prophets and priests of Baal out. And so there are 450 prophets of Baal already in the land, and there are 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. And so Elijah said to all of them, hey, get 2 bulls, and Baal's prophets can choose one for themselves and cut it and prepare it and set it on the altar with wood and all of that, but don't set fire to it. I'll do the same with the other bull. Then you call on the name of Baal, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and whichever God answers by fire, he is God. And so they gathered on Mount Carmel, and the prophets and priests of Baal took the bull that was given to them, and they prepared it, and they called on Baal from morning until noon, and of course there was no response. They danced around the altar they'd made, and at noon Elijah began to talk trash to him, and he said, shout louder! Maybe he's in deep thought or sleeping or traveling. Maybe he needs to be awakened. So they shouted louder, and they cut themselves with their knives to demonstrate their devotion, and they continued this frenetic kind of worship, dancing and shouting and waving their arms around until it was well into the evening, about supper time, and they passed out from exhaustion. But still there was no response. Nothing happened. Then Elijah carefully repaired the altar of the Lord that was there on Mount Carmel, and over the years had grown into disrepair, and somebody had torn it down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob. They're not one nation anymore, but they are still all descended from Jacob. And so Elijah included 12 stones, and he built this altar. He dug a trench around the altar big enough to hold 24 pounds of seed. Now, I don't know how much that is, but it's several gallons of water. And he arranged his wood and cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood. And then he said to his attendants, I want you to fill those 4 large water jars and bring them over here, and I want you to pour it on the offering and the wood. They did. He told them to do it again. They did. He told them to do it a 3rd time. And by this time, the offering is soaked, the wood is soaked, the stones are soaked, the trench around the altar is filled up with water, and everything is a muddy mess, of course. And then Elijah stepped forward, and he prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your command. And in an instant, the fire from the Lord burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil all around, scorched the earth, and even sopped up all the water in the trench. The people were in awe. And they cried out, partly in fear. And they said, the Lord, he is our God. And then Elijah commanded them to seize the prophets of Baal, and it got bloody. And they brought them all down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered every one of them. That's 850 prophets and priests. And Elijah said to Ahab, you go eat and drink, for there is the sound of heavy rain. Remember, they'd been in the midst of this terrible drought. And then the sky began to grow black and clouds, and the wind began to come up, and heavy rain started falling as Ahab rode off towards Jezreel. The power of the Lord, it says, came upon Elijah, and he ran back to Jezreel, and he beat Ahab, running on foot. Now, by this time, Jezebel's gotten word about what happened, and she sent a messenger to Elijah, and she basically said, hey, may the gods deal with me ever so severely if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like one of those prophets of Baal. Now, I'm not sure why, because Elijah was so tough and strong and powerful in the spirit. And now that Jezebel is making threats, he tucks tail and runs. And he ends up out in the wilderness under a broom bush. And as he sat down there, he prayed and he said, Lord, I've had enough. Take my life. And he laid down and he went to sleep. And an angel woke him up and gave him food and water and told him to eat because he had a journey ahead of him, and he did. And he fell back asleep, and the angel woke him up a second time and said, you need to eat because this is a long journey you're going to take. And so finally he got rested, and he went out on this journey. He traveled 40 days and 40 nights, and he came to Mount Horeb, which the Israelites called the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and he spent the night. And God came to him and he said, what a great question this is. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah began because he had lost perspective. Even great and powerful followers of God can lose perspective. He said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, and the Israelites have rejected your covenant and torn down your altars and put your prophets to death with the sword, and I'm the only one left, which was not true. From Elijah's perspective, it might have seemed that way. But he was not the only prophet. Remember, we just read a while back, Obadiah had 100 of them squirreled away in the caves. So Elijah was by no means the only prophet, but he felt alone and isolated and like he was the only one doing the right thing. And so God says to him, go out and stand on the mountain because I'm about to pass by. And then a great and mighty wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks, and God was not in the wind. And then an earthquake came along and everything shook, but God was not in the earthquake. And then a fire, and the fire consuming, brush and grass and all that around there, and God was not in the fire. And after all this blowing and shaking and burning and all of these demonstrative things and all that energy had been expelled and everything had died down and it was absolutely quiet, there came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his head and stood out at the mouth of the cave. And a voice said to him, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elisha said the same thing he'd said before. I've been very zealous and I've done the right thing. The Israelites have turned away from you and they're trying to put all of us to death, and I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. And at that point, the Lord said, Elijah, go back the way you came. On the way, I want you to anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha to succeed you as prophet. So he gave him some assignments, some important assignments. Now, did you notice he's anointing a new king? I wonder what Ahab's going to think about that. So Elijah went on his way, and he found this young man, Elisha. And he invited him to come and join in the ministry. But Elijah was pretty reluctant about the whole thing. He kind of was one of these guys, I think, that tended to work alone. But once Elisha got the invitation, whether from God or from Elijah himself, and he determined he was going, notice what Elisha does. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people of his village, and they all ate. So he basically eliminated all chance that he was going to turn back and come home once he started following Elijah. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. started out in First Kings with King Solomon. You know that he's the son of David, and he succeeded his father. David named him king under the leadership of God, but David's fourth son, Adonijah, rebelled against Solomon and was eventually killed. Solomon, when God came to him and said, I'll give you anything, Solomon asked for wisdom so that he could be a good leader. And not only did that please the Lord, but it also showed that Solomon was already relatively wise in that he knew a good thing to ask for. God was so pleased by his request that he said, I'm going to give you everything else in addition to wisdom. Solomon set about the work in chapters 1 through 11 of establishing his government. He had a highly organized, highly efficient government. He delegated where he needed to. He took great care of his people, and he gained a reputation in the entire region as the wisest of all the kings. He secured materials from near and far, and he built this wonderful, glorious temple in Jerusalem. He also built a palace. That's in chapters 5 through 7 of First Kings. And once the temple was built, the Ark of the Covenant was brought in, and it was placed in the Holy of Holies at the center, and the temple was dedicated. And when this happened, we read in chapter 8 that a cloud came down and filled the temple as God's way of signifying his acceptance of the building and his presence, not only in the building, but with the entire nation that was still unified under Solomon. He led Israel during its peak. Israel would never be more powerful. It would never be stronger than it was under Solomon, and it was also prosperous. But Solomon had his Achilles heel, and he did sin, and that ultimately led to his downfall. He sinned in at least 4 ways, and we covered these. He made an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt and married Pharaoh's daughter, and when she came, she brought with her pagan worship. And he amassed large amounts of gold and horses and chariots. Now, this is not to say God does not want anyone to be wealthy, but he did not want Solomon or the nation of Israel depending on their wealth and the power of their army. He wanted them to depend on him. And so not only did Solomon do that, he took hundreds of wives from foreign countries. He had numerous treaties with the countries all around him, which would seem politically, at least in that day, advantageous, but it was not the way God wanted him to work. And with each one of these new wives that would come into the nation, each of them brought their own form of pagan worship until the point that Solomon ultimately turned to those pagan gods himself. Then the kingdom divides, beginning with chapter 12. Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, was the rightful successor. He succeeded Solomon as king actually at the end of chapter 11. And when Rehoboam became king, his advisors, some representatives of the people came to him and said, listen, things are really good. The nation's prosperous, but under your father, we had to pay a lot of taxes. And so maybe you could back off on the taxes just a little bit and let the people out in the villages and in the farms and the communities have a little bit for themselves. It's still going on today, isn't it? And so they asked Rehoboam to lower their tax burden. He went to his older, more experienced advisors, and they advised him to give the people what they were asking for. But his friends, his younger advisors, the guys that came in on his coattail when he ascended to the throne, they told him, no, don't do that. In fact, increase it. And you tell them if they need to straighten up. And that caused the people to lose whatever little affection they had for Rehoboam. And this led to civil war. And along comes Jeroboam. Rehoboam, Jeroboam, not related, but they end up in civil war with one another. And these two are the ones that actually split the nation of Israel into two. Rehoboam became king of Judah. Jeroboam became king of Israel in the north. Now, Jeroboam didn't want his people going to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, and so he ended up building two regional worship centers, kind of, if you will, and these were represented with two golden calves. And so here we go. We've got idol worship in the northern kingdom, and he instructed his people to make their sacrifices at those two places, one in Bethel and one in Dan. And he also established his own priesthood and began to have religious festivals. In effect, Jeroboam set up his own religion. Then Shishak, king of Egypt, attacks Jerusalem. And because the civil war was taking all of their resources, the southern kingdom was somewhat weak. And when Shishak attacked, he carried off all the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the palace. And there was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, which kept both kingdoms relatively weak. Then Abijah succeeded his father Rehoboam in chapter 15 as the king of Judah. He was succeeded by Asa in the middle of chapter 15. And the thing about Asa is the scripture teaches his heart was fully committed to the Lord all his life, which, you know, because we've looked at this, made him a rare king. The theme of 1st and 2nd Kings seems to be he sinned against the Lord. He angered the Lord. He displeased the Lord. Israel, as well as Judah, has a succession of terrible kings, only broken once in a while by a good one who would come along and institute some reform. And then, of course, kings have a way of dying. And so that's what happened to Asa in the southern kingdom. While Asa was king in Judah, Nadab succeeded his father Jeroboam, and he reigned for 2 years, and then he was assassinated. And so that line of kings ended, and Baasha usurped the throne in the northern kingdom, and he ended up killing Jeroboam's entire family, which had actually been prophesied, and Baasha became king in Israel, while Asa is still king in Judah. Then Elah succeeded his father Baasha in chapter 16, and he was assassinated by a man named Zimri. Zimri usurped the throne. So again, now we've got a new line, a different family is now in charge. He usurped the throne and only reigned for 7 days. And things got so bad for him, and the people were attacking and rebelling against him, and he actually went into the royal palace, into the citadel, and he set the place on fire around him and killed himself. After Zimri came Omri. He was actually the military leader who led the revolt against Zimri, and he reigned for 12 years. But here it comes. Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him, and he reigned in Israel, the northern kingdom, for 12 years. Ahab succeeded his father Omri. We're in chapter 16 now of 1st Kings, and he reigned from the capital in Samaria for 22 years. Ahab may have been the worst king in the history of Israel. It says he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And during the reign of Ahab, along comes the prophet Elijah. Now, Elijah, don't misunderstand Elijah. He was not the only prophet in Israel. A lot of times in the Old Testament, we have different prophets, and they weren't prophesying or preaching or teaching over the entire nation. They were regional kind of teachers. But Elijah had a great deal of influence. And we also hear of Obadiah. And we're dealing now during the days of Elijah. Ahab is the king in Israel, and his wife is named Jezebel. And Jezebel was a strong proponent of Baal worship. And in fact, it came down to it, and Elijah ended up in a duel of sorts on Mount Carmel with the priests and prophets of Baal. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 850 priests and prophets. They all showed up there on Mount Carmel. We talked about this last Wednesday night. The long and short of it is, after all the demonstrative stuff that the priests of Baal did, and they cut themselves and they wailed and made all kinds of a fuss, obviously there is no one to light the offering on fire because Baal is false. And then Elijah prayed a very simple prayer, and God sent fire that not only consumed the offering, it consumed the wood, it consumed the stone altar, it lapped up the water all around the altar and scorched the earth where it had stood. And so Elijah then turned the people loose, and he said, execute all the priests and prophets of Baal. And he began attempting to remove Baal worship from the northern kingdom. Now, Jezebel gets wind of this, and she sends him a message, and basically she says, I'm going to kill you. And so Elijah fled, and God took care of him. And while he was fleeing, that's where we read about him encountering God, and God came to him in a still small voice. He didn't come to him in the wind. He didn't come to him in the earthquake. He didn't come to him in the fire. It was in a still small voice. Now, this is not to say that there's anything wrong with loud demonstrative worship if it is heartfelt, if it is authentic and true. I'm not knocking all of that, but I don't know about you, but I enjoy loud worship. I love to go to some of those big stadium events and gather with other Christians and you know, be loud and sing along and do all the stuff that you do at those things. And they're a blessing. Melanie and I had the opportunity to go not too long ago to the Capitol Theater in Flint. And that's not the biggest place in the world, but there were several hundred people that gathered there for Michael W. Smith. And he led us in worship. And what a blessing it was. However, when I really want to hear from the Lord, when I'm really seeking an answer from him, or I really want to draw in close to him, I need to be quiet. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but it's real hard to hear when you're talking. And it's real hard to hear when there's a lot of noise around. And so when I really want to get close and hear the voice, not with my physical ears, in my spirit, I need to be quiet. And once I still myself and I settle down and relax a little bit and just enjoy his presence, it's then that he directs me to a passage of scripture or a different, it gives me an answer to something that I'm confused about. And I think probably most of you understand that sometimes to really hear God's voice, we need to be quiet enough to hear him. And so that's the experience that Elijah had. And Elijah continued to prophesy and to teach there in the northern kingdom. He was never very well liked by Ahab, but God gave him the teaching that he delivered. And then God chose Elisha to succeed Elijah. Now, a lot of people get them confused. Of course, Elijah comes first, then Elisha. And Elijah is one of only a handful of people in the scriptures who never died. When his time came, he was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. And Elisha was there within sight of him, and he saw the chariot of fire and coming for Elijah. And when Elijah was taken up, his cloak, his covering, fell from him and landed, and Elisha caught it. And that was a symbolic way for God to say that he was passing the power from Elijah to Elisha. It was his authority and his prophetic power and his unique relationship with God. Then, meanwhile, in the southern kingdom, Jehoshaphat succeeds his father Asa. We're now in chapter 22. Jehoshaphat was a good king. So they had Asa, and then when Jehoshaphat came along, he followed in the footsteps of his father. And so Judah had a few decades there where things were good, and they were worshiping God, and they took care of things. But they did not remove the altars from the high places. You see that statement as you read through the text. That says, okay, they had the best of intentions. They got a lot of good things done, but they didn't quite get to the end of it. And those little remnants of pagan worship remained in the southern kingdom. Now, Jehoshaphat was a good king. And he was also, during his 25-year reign, at peace with the king of Israel. Ahaziah succeeded his father Ahab in chapter 22, and he reigned for 2 years, but he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And that's where 1 Kings comes to an end. We turn the page over into 2 Kings, and spoiler alert, 2 Kings is where both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah will be conquered and overrun and carried off into captivity. In chapter 17 of 2 Kings, the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians. And in fact, the northern kingdom never actually returns to Israel. The tribes of the northern kingdom, all those 10 tribes, they're actually still dispersed and nowadays throughout the world. And they never got back to their homeland in the northern kingdom of Israel. And in chapter 25, Judah is conquered and overrun by the Babylonians. And at that point, this beautiful temple of Solomon was destroyed, and those people were carried off into captivity as well. If you want to get an understanding of what it was like during those days, read the book of Lamentations. But that is something you better wait until you're in a really good mood before you read, because both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, when they came in, they just wreaked destruction and destroyed buildings, and they left, and I think I've told you this before, in both cases, they left all the old and the weak and the sick, many times the children, they just left them behind. And they took all of the strong ones, the promising ones, the good-looking ones, they took all of them away back to their homeland. And then what they also did, they would send people from back home to come in and settle in the conquered region. And that was their way of ensuring that this nation was never going to come back and be a problem again. So with that knowledge, as we begin going into 2 Kings, we begin, and we're still in the days of Elisha. This is not the song. The days of Elijah are over. These are the days of Elisha in chapters 1 through 13 of 2 Kings. Ahaziah is still king in Israel, and he fell, it seems, through the lattice of his upper room. and messed himself up pretty good. And he sent for Elisha and asked, am I going to live through this? And Elisha said, no, you're not. And because of his injuries, Ahaziah eventually died, and he had no son. So his brother Joram succeeded him as king. And Joram reigned for 12 years, and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. There's that phrase again. Now, the king of Moab began to rattle their sabers, and they began to come up against Israel, and Joram formed an alliance with Jehoshaphat. Now, this was not a reunification of the people of Israel. It was done strictly for military purposes. They went to Elisha, and he assured them of victory. And God gave them victory, and they defeated the Moabites. Then Elisha, and I preached from this text not too long ago, was approached by the widow of a man from the company of prophets. You may remember that message from that Sunday morning. This woman had died, and you may remember the story that the woman's husband had died, and she was left alone with her child, and her creditors were coming, and they were going to take her two sons as slaves. And God miraculously provided an abundance of oil for her, which they sold not only to pay their debts, but to live on going forward. Then a little later on in chapter 4 of 2 Kings, Elisha raised this Shunammite woman's son from the dead. And then Elisha healed a man named Naaman of leprosy. And being a man of God, he did not want to take payment, even though it was offered. He didn't want to take money for this movement, this miracle that God had carried out. And so Naaman wanted to pay Elisha because he'd been a leper, and now he's cured. And of course he wants to pay the man, but Elisha refused. But a little while later, Elisha's servant Gehazi snuck back there and asked for a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing. So then Elisha found out what Gehazi had done and his dishonesty, and Gehazi and his family were stricken with leprosy themselves. That's in chapter 5. Then we have a wonderful little story, and I hope you read this one. It's in Acts. Sorry about that. It's in 2 Kings chapter 6. And you have to understand that Elisha and some of these other prophets, they kind of banded together, and they would support one another, and they would come to one another's aid if help was needed. And the older prophets would actually teach the younger ones. And that's what was happening in 2 Kings 6, when Elisha is actually teaching this group of young men who are called by God into the office of prophet. And their number had grown, and they wanted to build a bigger dwelling. And so Elisha gave them his blessing, and they went on their way, and they're out in the woods, and they're felling trees, and they're doing all this stuff. And all of a sudden, the axe head flies off the handle of one of these young men's axe, and it lands in the water and sinks. And the young man was so upset because the axe was borrowed. And he had enough integrity to think, I'm going to have to replace that axe, and I don't have the means to do that, but I borrowed it. I have to make this right. And so Elisha made the axe head float, and the young man was able to bring it up out of the water and replace it, maybe put a new handle on it or whatever. My kids used to love that story. I used to love telling that when they were just little. Then Elisha advised Joram in the northern kingdom. Joram is the king of Israel, and Elisha advised him in his war against the Arameans. And this is where one episode is recorded there. We're in chapter 8, and one of the episodes is the Arameans pretty much got sick of Elisha as a military advisor to Joram, Because what would happen is Elisha would say to Joram, well, the Aramean army is massed over here. And Joram would say, well, cool, we're going over there. Or when it was time for a battle, Joram would consult Elisha and seek God's face as to whether or not he should engage the battle. And so word got back to the Arameans that, hey, they got this guy Elisha, and he's telling him everything you're planning to do. And so at some point, the leader of the Arameans got sick of it. And he sent an entire detachment of soldiers to go get Elisha. Can you imagine a whole attachment of soldiers, fully armed with chariots and all the stuff, sent to get one man of God? And so one morning, Elisha and he's got a young man that's just helping him, taking care of things, fetching water, stoking the fire, doing things that he can do to help Elisha. And he comes out of the tent in the morning and he looks up, and they're down in a little valley, and they're surrounded by these Aramean soldiers with chariots and swords and spears and all the stuff. And he goes back in and he tells Elisha, we're dead. And Elisha prayed that he would be able to see spiritually. Scripture calls it, he prayed that his eyes would be opened. And so when he did, he went back out, and Elisha told him, see, there's more for us than are against him, because he could see the armies of heaven surrounding those Aramean soldiers. And he knew that God would take care of them. So Elisha advised Joram throughout his reign, and specifically in the war against the Arameans. And then Jehoram succeeded his father Jehoshaphat. Don't get them mixed up. Joram is in Israel, the northern kingdom. Jehoram succeeded his father Jehoshaphat in the southern kingdom. And the good days ended for Judah, because Jehoram did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, for the sake of his servant David, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah. Things are starting to get a little frayed. Things are becoming problematic. Sometime later, the Arameans in the northern kingdom, they attacked Samaria, and the siege was awful. And anytime you have war, it's particularly hard on the people who live in the place where the war is being fought. And such was the case in Samaria. The siege lasted so long that the people in Samaria actually resorted to cannibalism. And so you've got that going on in the north. You've got the southern kingdom that is beginning to have some of its surrounding nations kind of come sniffing around. And so Jehoram succeeded his father. He reigned for 8 years. And then Ahaziah succeeded his father Jehoram. He reigned for only 1 year. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is in the southern kingdom of Judah. And meanwhile, Jehu was chosen by God to replace Joram. God became so done with Joram and the things that he was allowing to happen and all the stuff that his line of succession was broken. And God told Elisha, he had originally told Elijah to anoint Jehu. Elijah, for whatever reason, never quite got around to it, and it fell to his successor, Elisha, who delegated it to one of the young prophets. And here's the way it happened. And it lets you know, here's how things are getting in the northern kingdom. This is in chapters 9 and 10 of 2 Kings. He says to this young prophet, take this flask of olive oil with you and go to Ramoth Gilead. Look for Jehu. Get him away from his companions and take him into an inner room. Then take the flask and pour the oil on his head. Then declare, this is what the Lord says. I anoint you king over Israel. Then open the door and run. Because there's going to be a problem when you break the line of succession. And just like he had done with David years before, generations before, God chose David rather than one of Saul's descendants. God is changing up on this now. So Jehu was chosen to replace Joram. This is not a succession. And when the prophet poured the oil on Jehu's head and declared him to be king over the Lord's people, Israel, and he told him, "You are to destroy the house of Ahab, and I will avenge the blood of my servants that were shed by Jezebel. Dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her." And so all of this is going on, and Jehu went out to his fellow officers, and he says, "You're not going to believe what's happened. This guy came running here. He dumped oil on my head. He said, 'I anoint you king over Israel.'" And his fellow officers bought it. They supported him, and they blew the trumpet, and they shouted, "Jehu is king." And then Jehu went and carried out everything that the prophet had told him to do. They rode out. Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, rode out, each in his own chariot, to meet Jehu. They met him at the plot of ground that had belonged to Naboth. You remember the guy that was cured of leprosy. Jehu drew his bow and shot Joram between the shoulders, and he slumped down in his chariot. Jehu said, "Pick him up and throw him on the field that belonged to Naboth." So that's the end of Joram. And then when Ahaziah, king of Judah, saw what had happened, he turned and fled. And as he was running, he was wounded in his chariot, but he escaped to Megiddo, and he died there. And then Jehu went to Jezreel, and when Jezebel heard about all of this, she began to get ready to receive this new king, and some of her own servants came in and threw her out the window. She was up on a higher floor, and they threw her out the window. And when they finally found her, the dogs had eaten her to the point where only her skull, her feet, and her hands were left. The Bible can be gruesome at times. That's one of the reasons we believe it's true. It is real, honest to goodness life. And then Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria to the officials of Jezreel and the elders and the guardians of Ahab's children. And he said to them, basically, "I'm coming." And he told him to send out all 70 of the princes of Ahab. Actually, he would say, "I'm coming and I want you to execute them before I get there." They wouldn't do that. They just kicked all those 70 princes out of Samaria. And so they were, no, I'm telling it wrong. He wanted them to send them out, but they were so afraid they killed them right there in Samaria. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for just a second. So Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief friends, his chief men, his friends, his priests, and all of that. And he took care of the things that he was told to take care of. And then he brought all the people together, and he sent word throughout Israel, and all the servants of Baal came. He had them all gathered together. Remember all these priests and stuff. When Jezebel was still alive, she was very favorable to Baal worship. And so there were a ton of prophets and priests to Baal. And Jehu called them all together and told them he wanted them to make a great offering. And it was very important that they all be there. And once they all got there, he told all the people to kill them. And the guards and officers threw the bodies out and then entered the inner shrine of the temple of Baal. They brought the sacred stone out of the temple of Baal and burned it. They demolished the sacred stone and tore down the temple of Baal, and the people have used it for a latrine to this day. Jehu reigned for 28 years, and it seemed like a real good time in the history of Israel, the northern kingdom. But there's a very telling verse in chapter 10, verse 32. In those days, the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel because the chosen people of God are not being faithful. He is beginning to reduce their land. Then there is this woman named Athaliah. She's in Judah, and her son Ahaziah died. And rather than name another king, she became queen because apparently she was tough enough to do it. She reigned for 6 years, and she's the only queen of either nation, Israel or Judah. And when she saw that her son was dead, she went and executed all the rest of the royal family. But they took Joash, a son of Ahaziah, and hid him. And he remained hidden with his nurse in the temple. And so Jehoiada, the high priest, assembled the military commanders and the royal bodyguards secretly in the temple. They were loyalists who did not support the queen, and he showed them Joash. Now, this is taking years to develop. And so they've got this little boy, Joash. He's the last surviving heir of Ahaziah. He is the rightful king of Judah. And Athaliah does not want him around. So then they made a plan. The commanders, they came to Jehoiada. He gave the commanders the spears and shields that had belonged to King David, and they were in the temple of the Lord. And the guards stationed themselves around the king. And Jehoiada, the priest, put the crown on him and declared him to be king, even though he was just a boy. They anointed him, and they clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" And Athaliah heard the noise, and she went looking, and when she saw what happened, she was ticked. And so she tore her robes, and she called out, "Treason!" And at that point, Jehoiada ordered the military commanders to bring her out and put the sword to her and anyone who follows her. So they seized her as she reached the place where the horses entered the palace grounds, and there she was put to death. And so Joash replaced Athaliah in Judah, succeeding his father Ahaziah. And he reigned for 40 years. And Joash came the closest of any of the kings of Judah of really cleaning house. The people destroyed the temple of Baal. They smashed the altars. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years Jehoiada the priest instructed him. He instituted repairs on the temple. But unfortunately, his officials conspired against him, and he was eventually assassinated. And then there is Jehoahaz. He succeeded Jehu in Israel. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then Joash succeeded him. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The only thing different during his reign was when Elisha died. Then in chapters 14 through 17, we have descriptive text of the fall of Israel. This is the end of the northern kingdom. In Judah, Amaziah succeeded his father Joash, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed his father's example. He executed the officials who murdered his father. He was captured in battle with Jehoash, who plundered Jerusalem and took hostages back to Samaria. So Jehoash captured him. His son Azariah began to reign when his father was captured, and Amaziah was executed by some of his own officials. Jeroboam II succeeded his father Jehoash in Israel, and Azariah succeeded his father Azariah in Judah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but he contracted leprosy and had to move out of the palace, and Jotham ruled in his stead. We're going to move quick now and try to finish this up, okay? Then we go in Israel. We go from Zechariah to Shallum to Menahem to Pekahiah. And they all did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Pekahiah was actually assassinated by a man named Pekah, who usurped the throne and then reigned in Israel for 20 years. And it was during the reign of Pekah that the Assyrians began conquering portions of Israel. He was assassinated by Hoshea. We'll get to him in a second. In Judah, we have Jotham. And then we have Ahaz. He was one of the more wicked ones, even sacrificing his own son. He paid off the Assyrians who were attacking in the northern kingdom so that they'd leave Judah alone, at least for a while. Then we have Hoshea. He assassinated Pekah, as I said, and usurped the throne. And then he was overrun by the Assyrians. And they did as I described. They carried off all the good ones. They brought in some of their own people. Hoshea is the last king of Israel. So now we're only down to Judah. Hezekiah succeeded his father Ahaz, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. However, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib of Assyria attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and conquered them. Hezekiah attempted to buy him off with gold from the temple as well as the palace, but the siege continued. God intervened, and Sennacherib withdrew. Then Manasseh succeeded his father Hezekiah. He worshiped pagan gods in the temple itself. Amon succeeded his father Manasseh and was assassinated by one of his own officials. Josiah succeeded his father Amon. He reigned for 31 years, and he, as I said, was the good king. He led Israel in repentance and restoration of the covenant, and he was killed in battle with the Egyptians. Then in Judah, we have this rapid succession of bad kings who did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin. They all did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Jehoiachin actually surrendered to King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians. He was taken prisoner and carried off to Babylon. Zedekiah was put in place by Nebuchadnezzar in Jerusalem. And so technically, he is the last king of Judah. He actually led a revolt against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed Jerusalem to the point where historians tell us not one stone was left attached to another. And so we close the book on 1st and 2nd Kings with a decimated people. The nation of Israel in the north has been conquered by the Assyrians and carried away. The nation of Judah in the south has been conquered by the Babylonians and carried away. I encourage you this week to read 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Yes, it is a lot of repetition. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, many scholars believe, was actually written for the people that were carried off to Babylon, for the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Now, they're the only ones that are surviving at this point, because the ones that were carried off by the Assyrians from the northern kingdom, they never make it back. But we're going to find out later on that the ones that were in Babylon were allowed to come back. And that's when we get into the rebuilding and all that. We'll get to that. But many believe 1st and 2nd Chronicles was actually written for those people who were captives in Babylon, because generation after generation lived in Babylon, and the stories and the history of the nation began to be lost. And so 1st and 2nd Chronicles was a way to combat that loss of their religious heritage. So close the book on that. We'll leave it here. That's a good spot to stop for tonight, seeing as how we've actually finished it this time. And as we call a wrap to it, both nations have been destroyed. All the ones that are healthy and strong have been carried away. Most of them were taken away to Assyria. A smaller portion of them are now in Babylon, and we'll take up next Wednesday night with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I hope to see all of you who live in the area Sunday morning. Come join us for worship, okay? God bless you guys. I love all of you. Good night.